Okay, today we're going to look into the dating of creation. And this is an article that's going to be more about religious and traditional beliefs. And this is not really more about the scientific consensus that we've come up with due to aging. That's more of like age of the universe and age of the earth. And I've done a couple of videos on this subject already. And this is a little bit more of a different viewpoint of it, and also looking at it from a few people's different viewpoints that become important to our eventual religion that we have today and belief systems that we carry on to this day. Um, Dating creation is the attempt to provide an estimate for the age of Earth, and a lot of times for the age of universe, as understood through the origin myths of various religious traditions. Now, various traditional beliefs held that planet Earth, or the entire universe, was brought into being in a grand creation event by one or more gods. And one of these cultures developed, once these cultures developed calendars, many began to ponder the question of precisely how long ago this event had happened. And you can see that people didn't actually have a calendar from a certain date until we did the modern calendar that we have today, which is dated off of Christ, of course, and for our BC thing and the dating of that. But it's more of a modern era thing also. Um, and of course, because of the biblical connection to it, now we look at it as being just more like considering the modern era. And what led up to it in our history that we know of it. Now, these calendars that people developed too, we know now that a lot of people used to use ancient lunar calendars. And so there's a definite deviation. You have over 13 moons inside of each year, and it leaves over 11 days, right? And so this is also where you get like a 12 days of Christmas concept. And then, of course, the sacred 12 comes from a Sumerian thing. And I don't want to get off into things like that too much and before we get into each one individually. But there was original lunar calendars. And so a lot of these archaic dates you can take and divide by 13 and get something that seems a little more reasonable. And a lot of people don't make that connection. They just say a SAR is a year. It's not a lunar cycle, and so on from that. But when we look at this, we're going to look at Sumerian and Babylonian later, of course, which we all try to encompass into one, but it's definitely a thing that lasts for quite a few thousand years and starts with an origin that ends up with a different ending and so on. And of course, in the Bible, Babylon's looked at as being a terrible thing whenever the origin of the Bible itself comes out of there. It's kind of a strange flip-flop, which I've shown you in quite a few videos. And we'll look at Egyptian stories, which of course we now see the Egyptians come just a little bit later. And in a video that I have about to come out, which is of course a redo, the Sumerian Egyptian connections. And we'll be looking at that here with Shemsu-Hor and the followers of Horus and where they come from, reed boats and things that go along with that. Then you have Greco-Roman beliefs, which is a strange thing too, because they pin themselves towards one of the first kings that can be remembered by anybody and run themselves forward from that, and two kids in the pantheon that Romulus and Remus in the ancient story of that. But then we'll also look at Zoroastrianism, which seems to come later than that. So these are pretty much in order, if you will. And then the Chinese mythos, which comes shortly after Hinduism. And then you have the Mayan culture beliefs. And then you have Abrahamic religions and so on that come out of that. And this really is pretty much in order of the way that they happen, although one would have to say Hinduism is based off of earlier beliefs that go way back and probably pin themselves into what we would consider between 2 and 3, or perhaps even before Egyptian, and in pieces of it. And then you'd also say Zoroastrianism has based on Sumerian and Babylonian beliefs, and then you'd have to figure out that those are based on other beliefs that came before that. The one that's really not on this list is Proto-Indo-Europeans, and I'm going to go into that into a separate vid on itself. It's because of, I guess, because of what we're specializing in right now and leading in, because I'm trying to lead some uh, path for people to have an understanding of Proto-Indo-Europeans ended up becoming these civilizations, and then or leading and helping to lead some of these situations uh, in civilizations, and how archaic belief systems uh, that are real primordial and sun god worship and things along those lines end up creating the religious system that we have today, and everybody has in their own separate way a variation on a theme that's carried out through all of Middle Eastern and of course up into European and so on, and North African belief systems. The So I guess before I even get into it, let me kick this off here real quick. Here's a ancient depiction here, and this is from Wenceslas Haller, King Wenceslas. It's kind of a strange name to have for a person, but then again, people are named after famous people, and all of us carry names. A lot of people are named after biblical names and so on. Here you see that this is their idea of creation, and this is the Tigris and Euphrates running themselves together, and the headwinds, and how this garden was up here. And so you can see how the Tigris and Euphrates come in together at once in the delta here, and another river leads into it. Now this gives an inclination towards, I guess, the Nile, and this would be an inclination perhaps towards India and so on. Of course, the shoreline doesn't depict anything like that necessarily, but maybe a concept. And you see a lot of mountains in the north, and how the rivers run out of that. And so the Tigris and Euphrates, when they come up, they split, and this runs over into an Anatolia type of region also. So what does this show us? Well, that Eden was pretty much in that area, and the Sumerians, ironically, their land that was fertile for their use of them, which would have been down in this area here, was what was known as Eden. It was the floodplain that was usable. This is the same concept that is used by these people, and the same concept that's found over in Egypt again. And primordial floods are something that easily can relate all these people together, and it's things that had happened. And did they all happen at once? Did all these clouds and stuff do a lot of rain at one time and so on? I don't know if you can see it in this video here, but we're really depicting here Yahweh. And if you'll look in the idea of creation, Yahweh is the sun god. Yahweh is the sun. And of course, Jesus is declinated as being the sun. And in fact, his birthday and his concept rides around that idea, where the sun slowly goes 1 degree lower and lower in the sky per day through the fall, where we have our autumn, and also is the fall. And so as the Son of God falls down, it goes 1 degree per day, reaching its solar maximum low, which of course winter up here is summer in South America, and then South American winter it's reversed back. But in the archaic belief systems, the sun goes far over. You can see this is not directly above head at noon. This is at its far length. So here's the concept, and it stays still at its lowest point, and then starts to come back up over us and give us summer, and then go back to the other side. And of course, at this time, people didn't realize that we were in a slight wobble that created this whole effect. They thought maybe the sun was doing this effect, that it's a chariot that rides across the sky, and he rides in different ways. It's all mysterious, but it does, the farther north you get, the more you get a concept of seasons. And the closer to the equator you get, the less of an idea or a concept of seasons that you have. And so it makes it harder for things to be done on a yearly basis. But what can be clocked is this flood. And then, of course, moons, we're seeing that, and it's go through its cycles real easily. And women's cycles go along with the moon quite well. And so this is something that primordially from way back when is brought into an idea of a calendar system. It takes about 9 moons after a woman stops having her period and becomes pregnant, that she will conceive and have a child, right? And it's really about 13 that end up making a full year that goes around. And you see this in some of the videos that I've shown here recently, and so on. So let's just go ahead and get into this, because I don't want this to run into too many of a section, and I'm afraid I won't be able to get this into one, surely. Sumerian Babylonian beliefs. The standard ancient Sumerian kings list, listed on WB 444, lists various mythical antediluvian kings and gives them reigns of several tens of thousands of years. The first Sumerian king, Alulim at Eridu, is described as reigning for 28,800 years. And this is taking a shot with lunars at being a full zodiac cycle, that certain kings were given this cycle and it ran through and brought through. But that's almost for a whole nother video itself, on how that runs around a cycle and then kicks into the cycle of mankind. But it's followed by several later kings of similar periods, in fact some even longer. In total, these antediluvian kings ruled for 241,200 years, from the time when the kingship was lowered to heaven to when the time the flood swept over the land. And I'm showing this also in the Sumerian connection video, and how that goes together with it. So I want to make a key point on that, but just that also the kingship was lowered from heaven. At first it was gods, at first it was things that seemed to be a mythical people, right? That these ancestor worship, veneration, people of old, somebody was so great that was the big thing, that was before the big thing, it was before the big thing, and they give them dates that end up being zodiacal. So you can tell these people have an astronomy situation going on way early. Anyhow, excavations in Iraq have revealed evidence of localized flooding at Shuruppak, which is near Tel Farah, and various other Sumerian cities, all dated to the same time. A layer of riverine sediments, radiocarbon dated to circa 2900 BC, as I talked about in a few of my videos recently, and the Sumerian one about the lament of Ur, and Inanna's lament for Ur. It interrupts the continuity of settlement. It interrupts the continuity of people. It changes the setup, what goes on. It changes the end of Ubaid period and coming in. It makes things change quite a bit. They already have the writing for it, but it's an archaic writing. Later they have a writing for it, and they write of the story from before, and they also tell of another from way before. But I'm starting to digress too much. But this flood extends from the lower parts on both the Tigris and Euphrates all the way far north as the city of Kish. And so whenever they say all of Sumer was destroyed, then they're kind of referring to it. See if it'll show you a picture where Kish is. Well, they won't show it's a coastal city in capital Kish, direct Bendar County and stuff, but up there. And so that's where Kish, or Cush of the Bible's origin comes from, whenever they talked about him being from that area. And then anyhow, polychrome pottery from the Jemdet Nasser period of 3029 BC was discovered immediately below the Shuruppak flood stratum. The flood described in the Sumerian Kings list is believed to have historical basis and has been dated to 2900 BC again. Adding the 241,200 years to 2900 gives the date of about 244,100 BC, that they actually have recorded humanity in their thoughts in some way. And we really have actually seen here shortly ago, they found in a cave in Jebel Irud in northern Morocco a modern Homo sapiens, what we consider to be a modern human today, dating to 215,000 years and 230,000 years, and now they found one at 315,000 years, So this can easily correlate to hitting that date or past. But anyhow, um, so this pottery that they found there, the flood is described in the Sumerian King's List is believed to have historical basis and has been dated to 2900 BC. And then when you add those numbers together, you end up with that number. However, most modern scholars do not believe the ancient Sumerians or Babylonians believed in a chronology of their own that was this old, that they weren't a people that were as modern as they are now, sitting right here and having that, but that this was probably a projected date towards all of humanity. Okay, so we're looking at a difference between what you would say is a creation of Adam, which is let forth into a world where there's already domesticated animals and a garden, right? I mean, let's be rational and realistic about this situation. So they're talking about perhaps like mankind in this way. So instead, they believed that these figures were either fabrications or were based on not literal solar years, but instead lunar months, which are 29.53059 days. And that they had figured out this thing, and they also had figured out the leap year concept. These people, if they were garnished the way the actual Egyptians were garnished, we would have a different world than we have today. And indeed, they led into Egypt at this 2900 BC, this pivotal time where we go, 2900 to 3100 BC, that's whenever Egypt starts itself. And indeed, there had been a flood before this, as I described, and it was never supposed to happen again. God made a rainbow and all those things, right? Well, that comes from the Sumerians. And the whole flood concept, Utnapishtim, and letting loose ravens and doves and so on, but it was never supposed to happen again. And then it happened again, much, much worse. And then another people took over. And of course, times back then when people took over, they had conquered your God. My God is stronger than your God. My dad can beat up your dad. You see what I'm saying, right? And so in some ways, they usurp the power of that God, and now they have that. What you have, I have, and stuff like that. I have fire, and it starts from way, way back whenever I have fire, and so on. But Cicero, reacting to the chronologies such as Berosus, who composed a Greek language history of Babylonia, known as the Babylonica, during the 3rd century BC, strongly criticized the claim that the Babylonians had kings going back hundreds of thousands of years. He says, "Let us scorn the Babylonians, the men whose records, as they themselves assert, cover a period of 470,000 years in total." Diodorus Siculus, of course, these are over each other. And in a moment, you can also notice some of the names of these people almost are relegated to what they do and what they're done in history and so on, and how their names mean something. Diodorus Siculus also wrote something similar about how he believed the Babylonians fabricated their chronology. "A man can scarcely believe them," Babylonians, "as for they reckon that down to Alexander's crossing over into Asia, it has been 470,000 years, 73,000 years, so he's off right here, but 473,000 years since they began in early times to make their observations of the stars." Indeed, there's other deals where they tell you, other histories that tell you that the Ur of the Chaldees have been watching astronomy for over 230,000 years in one recollection, and in the other, this exact date right here, where we go 473,000 years, that they can astronomically look back at these dates. Well, if we look at the Mayan calendar, you can roll it forward, but the neat thing about it is because it links, you can roll it backwards, and you can go all the way back to whenever. So when happens what makes the truth. I mean, you can just roll it and go, okay, well, we roll it again. And at one point in history here, there's also a competition for who was first, right? And I'll get into that a little more later. But despite these criticisms, some ancient Greeks, including most notably Alexander Polyhistor, so multiple history, and Proclus, so the beginning of, believed that the Babylonian kings were hundreds of thousands of years old, and the Babylonians dated their creation to 400 to 200,000 years before their own time, and there you go with that, the kind of the 230 thing and so on. And I'm telling you, that's trying to relegate, I'm guessing, humanity in some way. But of course, this also tries to show you, if you're into the Sitchin concept, where how things had happened. But you've got to believe also that if you believe it started way back then, that these gods that were pretty inept and slow at getting things going, and really, well, I guess in reality, if they were just men in the first place that lived real long like elves somehow, you know, and maybe like Superman from their planet, which had more gravity, here they have less, so they're super strong, right? That concept, that whole little Superman idea, that you could pull off something like this. But I don't want to get into that totally on this one either. I'm just going to go ahead and go on with it. I believe I've covered that pretty well as a concept. Later I'll say something else. But now we get into the Egyptians. The ancient Turin kings lists a mythical pre-dynastic reign of the gods, which first occurred 36,620 years before Menes, which Menes was around 3050 BC, give or take something. And so this is almost at that 2900, 3050. It's, 50 years, 51, if you will. Therefore, the dating creation around 39,670 BC. One fragment from Manetho also dates the reign of the first Egyptian god Ptah at 36,525 years before Menes, and Menes is the guy that's looked at as being the one that mended together North and South Egypt, that became the first, what we call dynasty now. But we know now there was pre-dynastic before that, and it goes way back. And we can find archaic remains in East Africa and up through the Horn of Africa, down of Caucasians, and definitely even down into the Cape area. There's a Hofmeyr site, which dates to around 40,000 BC, 38 to 40,000 BC, which shows endemic at that point Caucasians in that area. Of course, this is when everything was a jungle. This is back in the last ice age, whenever everything is cramped down and no one is living really northern or the Mediterranean type idea. Your Arctic Circle was all under ice. In fact, coming way down from that in the continental ice shelves and so on that go on, and that you can see encroaching way down much farther south than those lines. But other fragments, though, of Manetho, which is under Eusebius, George Sensalius, and preserved in Felix Jacobi's FGRH, however, list different dates. Eusebius in his chronicle recorded that these were the first to hold sway in Egypt. Thereafter the kingship passed from one another in unbroken succession through 13,900 years after the gods. Demigods reigned for 1,255 years, and again another line of kings held sway for 18,017 years. Then came 30 more kings reigning from 1,790 years, and then again 10 kings ruling for 350 years, a much less time. There followed the rule of the spirits of the dead for 5,813 years. I'll try to say some more on that in a minute. But let's add that up real quick. So 13,900 years plus 1255 plus 1817 plus 1790 plus the 350 of that smaller range, then the 5,813 years equals 24,950 years. And counting back from Menes, which is 3050 BC, fixes the creation at 28,000 BC, somewhere around where we're thinking Cro-Magnon and is coming into himself, which really now we find goes back maybe 40,000 years, somewhere in there. But when did they get it going on? When did they really get it going on? Is this what we're looking at? Or is it the first one? And so on. So, we're targeting these points at something, but is it really the point of all creation? Well, in the biblical idea, it just happened a day before, a couple of days before. So, clap and let there be light. And then there's the sun god. He is the light. How do you create? Oh, I don't want to get into creation and how there's actually light before there's. Anyhow, let's just go on. So that adds up to there. Now, the strange thing that we get out of that is that they tell you that they were gods at one point, way back in the very first point, right? Some 28 to 30,000 years ago, there were gods, and then demigods, which were mixed people, right? They would have reigned from then. If you take these numbers, which they're calling years, and you go with a lunar cycle of it, so when you have something like the first number here of 13,900, and you say, well, if I divide that by 13, that ends up being 1,000 years, and 1255 ends up being, well, that's not even 1,000 years. That's 1255 would just be 100 years or so, and then 18 and 17, all these divided by there. 350, well, maybe 350 is a reality number when they started and figured the lunar calendar. And then you get 5,813 years out of that after, right? So 5,813, are they pretty good with that number? Because it's not too far off from the idea of the first settlements of Sumeria. Not necessarily what we see as Nakata 1 or 2 coming into Egypt or so, but it does line up with a little bit more of that, and also a lot with the Proto-Indo-European sites. So could this be alluding to that concept? Well, let's just continue on here before we have to go into a part 2 probably on this. It'll probably be a little smaller than this one, but I don't want to push it on this one. We'll put them back to back. If it does go into 2 parts, it'll be in the top left-hand corner. You'll be your next one. So anyhow, the ancient Greeks reported similar figures on ancient Egyptian chronology. Diogenes Laertius recorded that the ancient Egyptians dated their creation to their first god Hephaestus, which is a god of the forges, who by Interpretogracia was Ptah. And so Interpretogracia is an idea of saying, so all of these gods were similar forms of each one, and they have different aspects, and the Greeks' gods were the gods of the world of that time. So that would make him, that's Ptah. That's the first one who did a forging concept, but this also puts forth a volcanic type of god. So anyhow, according to Laertius, Hephaestus, Ptah lived 48,863 years before Alexander the Great at 356 BC, dating the creation to 49,219 years, nearly 50,000 BC, which now does put you in the idea of all these cave art paintings and their oldest dates and so on like that we find. And so what are we talking about? Creation of man. When we're talking about this, not necessarily the planet, and then not necessarily the universe in relation to the planet, in relation to man, but we're looking at that. Herodotus wrote that the ancient Egyptians had gods who